As we start out with this video, I'd like to reinforce the ideas that we had where we're comparing and contrasting Darwin's ideas and Lamarck's ideas. So remember, Lamarck had this idea of independent origin of every species. So that infers there has to be very frequent spontaneous generation, and that complex animals are more complex because they've been around longer. So they've had longer for them to be exposed to the environment, change as they're exposed to the environment, and then pass those characteristics down to their offspring. Darwin, on the other hand, said no, all life on Earth shares a common origin. Simple things are simple because there are niches that simple things do well in, and so they have adapted and filled those niches. And more complex things have filled the niches for more complex things, but they've been around for the same amount of time and they all share a single common ancestor. Now remember, Darwin also didn't know where all of the diversity came from, because natural selection, if you'll remember, is a variational process. And so that means that over time we're going to lose diversity if we only have natural selection. So we have to have some other force to bring in new diversity into a population. Now today we know that that's random mutations, and that those mutations bring in diversity, and the natural selection works on it to decide which of it stays around. We also have a third component, genetic drift, which we're not going to address, and Darwin really didn't understand, didn't know anything about, and is also important, but in different aspects as we expanded Darwin's theories and began to understand the nature of evolution in more detail. And we'll look at that a little bit in this one, but really that's a discussion for the coming chapters. So, Lamarck, independent origin and acquired characteristics are passed down. Darwin, common origin, or what he called common descent, and that the diversity that's present in populations gets selected on by natural selection, but that acquired traits are not passed on. And this idea of not passing down acquired traits really was a little bit difficult for people to kind of wrap their minds around at first, but when you think about doing an experiment, it really makes sense, right? So if you take a mouse and chop off its tail and then let it reproduce, its babies are not going to have any impact. They're not going to have shorter tails. If that was true, we could do all sorts of really quick, interesting changes, and evolution would be very, very rapid, right? So you imagine organisms that lost their limbs and then had babies, those babies would lose their limbs. Or if we surgically augmented an individual, right, and made them stronger, gave them breast implants, then their babies would not have those characteristics. And today you kind of, yeah, okay, that's obvious, but at the time it wasn't. And so really this was a dramatic insight and a breakthrough when Darwin proposed this idea. Now, because of this, old disciplines, systems that had been around for a long time, began to be revised. So taxonomy had been around for, at least Linnaean taxonomy, for a couple hundred years, and other forms of taxonomy had been around for even farther than that. And so now we begin to use our understanding of relationships to reassess and maybe even revise our classifications. Phylogenetics really doesn't get started until about 100 years after Darwin, when we begin to have computers and other formal methods to do it. But they'd been, at Darwin's time, they began to do informal phylogenies, to do, okay, I think these are the relationships because I'm an expert and I know a lot about these, but there really wasn't a formal way to test that. And so these old disciplines begin to become revised, take on new life in the light of this shared common ancestry. Now, during Darwin's time, there were three quote-unquote problems that were really difficult to solve. Some were solved a little bit more quickly as new people began to write and work on Darwin's. Others really weren't solved and are still being worked on to some extent, but have been largely solved, but not until our modern times. So number one, Darwin's theory said that little tiny diversity in organisms is passed down, and that those little changes can build up and build up and build up until we get very complex structures. Now, that poses some problems. So for instance, one of the criticisms of Darwin's theory was, what good is half of an eye? Meaning that if we evolve a little tiny change to give you, say, part of an eye, but it's not functional, there's no way that that should be selected for, that we need the complete eye before it provides a benefit. Now, to a large extent, we understand that there are steps, and even though if we don't know all of the steps along the way, there are steps that can be integrated and put together step by step to give our very complex features. So for instance, we don't have a lot of evidence about all of the steps along the way to the origin of the vertebrate eye. However, on the mollusk eye, we have many species that have maintained those early primitive steps. And so amongst the mollusks, we see some that only have light sensing organs. Basically, is it light or is it dark? We see others that have a very primitive kind of a pinhole camera system. And then all the way up to octopus and squid, which have fully functioning, very complex eyes. And so this is really something that is handled on a case-by-case basis. But for many, not all, but for many of the complex organisms, we know the step-by-step, the way that we got to those complex things. Number two, this one actually was a criticism, but was fairly easily and soon after Darwin's theories was fairly well addressed, which is that why do organisms have not complex, but have traits that are no longer adaptive, like vestigial characteristics we talked about. And this came out of the idea that Darwin was saying that organisms will adapt and become perfectly suited to their environment. Now, that might be putting words in Darwin's mouth, because I don't know that he ever said perfectly suited. But people realize that, in fact, under Darwin's theory, you would expect to see vestigial features, because organisms adapt to an environment, but environments change. And so a feature that was once incredibly adaptive, you get put into a new environment and suddenly it's no longer useful. In fact, might even be detrimental for you to have that feature. And so over time, mutations occur, and then selection removes those features. And so we end up with a remnant, a vestigial feature that was once really important, but now no longer serves a purpose for that organism. And then finally, this is the big one. Darwin realized, and this was never addressed during Darwin's lifetime. In fact, it took about 100 years, a little less, about 80 years or so, before we began to understand and address this problem. And Darwin realized that his proposal for natural selection should mean that populations are incredibly non-diverse, that they should only have the features that have been selected for over millions of years. Other features, other diversities that aren't as good should be eventually removed, maybe even very rapidly removed. And so we should have very little or almost no diversity in our populations if Darwin's ideas of natural selection were the only force that was acting on a population. Now again, today we know that it's random mutation coupled with the way that sexual reproduction and genetics work, and those maintain and increase the diversity in populations. And so we can explain that the fact that populations are not non-diverse, that they maintain their variation by this force of new mutations, bringing in diversity, balancing out the forces of genetic drift and natural selection. So a couple other things that were critical as we began to integrate Darwin's ideas into biology and come up with our modern biology. A little bit after Darwin, we have August Weismann, a name you need to know, a German researcher who is the central figure in what we now call germ theory, or sometimes germ plasm theory. And along with evolution, germ theory, sometimes people say cell theory also, but germ theory and evolution are the two central foundations for all of modern biology. You already know germ theory, but if you can't quite remember exactly what it is, here it is. It's rather simple. Number one, all living organisms are made up of cells. Number two, all cells come from other living cells, either by mitosis or meiosis. And that's it. Rather simple and straightforward. But if you think about the implications of this, you realize that this gets rid of the idea of spontaneous generation. If all cells come from other living cells, then we can't have dead cells or inorganic material that spontaneously generate into new forms of life. Now, obviously, somewhere in the very ancient origins of all life on Earth, there was a spontaneous generation event. And we talked a little bit about that when we looked at the origin of life on Earth. There's still a lot of mysteries surrounding how life came from, and many unanswered questions that may remain unanswered because it's very difficult to exactly reconstruct characteristics and events that occurred in those ancient primitive seas in early Earth. But however it occurred, we had a single spontaneous generation event where we get living cells. Those living cells diversify, break into separate populations, go on, evolve, change, and eventually become all life on Earth, all connecting back to that single common origin of life on Earth. And germ theory just reinforces that idea that all living cells that we know of today share that connection and come from an unbroken chain of living cells going back all the way to the first life on Earth. The other major researcher that we need to talk about that helped to resolve and reinforce these ideas, resolve the problems with Darwin's theory, and reinforce his ideas was Gregor Mendel. Now, if you look at the dates, you notice that Gregor Mendel was a contemporary with Darwin. He was born a little bit later, lived a little bit longer, but was working and was active researcher at about the same time Darwin was. And so he was working on his ideas of genetics, working primarily with pea plants and doing very intricate, long experiments, careful crossbreeding experiments, and came up with the foundations for what we now call genetics. And so he explained a mechanism of inheritance about the same time Darwin was writing on his and publishing his books, his book, The Evolution of Species. Now, Mendel published in German, published in a small obscure journal, and was largely ignored. He was essentially 80 years ahead of his time, and things may have been quite different or may have progressed at a different rate, at least, if Mendel had been recognized for I was going to say genius, but at least for the incredibly important scientific contributions that he was making to the field. And so Mendel was largely ignored for 80 years. It wasn't until about the 1930s that people began to reread his work, rediscover it, test it out in fruit flies, and expand beyond his model organism of the pea plant, and began to realize that this was an incredibly important work and established that as the foundation for modern genetics, and then built on it and added to it in our modern complex. Okay? And this would have, to some extent, helped to explain the loss of diversity problem that was a criticism of Darwin's theory of evolution. Okay? But it wasn't known. It wasn't until the mid-1900s we began to put it together. So in the mid-1900s, we begin to unify Darwin's theories of evolution, natural selection, and Mendel's ideas of genetics, and then people begin to work and expand and put those together, and we integrate them into modern biology. This is termed the modern synthesis. And again, it really began in the 1930s and 40s and is an ongoing process today. So the modern synthesis is the fusion of the theories of evolution with modern understanding of genetics. And in the coming lectures, we're going to outline and go over the major important points for these. Now, there are many, many researchers who contributed to this, and I've got lots of images here, but I'm not asking you to know any of these. You might come across some of them now and then. Haldane, Dobzhansky. There are many others, but don't worry about memorizing them. You don't need to know them. But they began to do things like understand the role of mutation and how that adds diversity. What role does sexual reproduction play in evolution? What about polygeny, where many, many genes all contribute into a single, where there are many, many traits that it can all be influenced by the same gene, and vice versa. We'll look at all of these, genotype versus phenotype. We're going to spend lectures, in some cases, talking about these. So don't worry about it now, but just know that all these complex things, some of which you've learned in introductory biology or genetics class, begin to come integrated, and we get one cohesive theory of evolution that uses modern genetics and germ theory and all of our understanding. Now, to wrap up, we're going to revisit this idea of Malthus, and we had proposed this question. Was Malthus right about the human population? Is there a crisis point? And if so, where is it? Have we reached it? So remember, I showed you this diagram looking at human population, how essentially it has grown exponentially since about 1800. We've seen dramatic exponential growth. Now, signs are that exponential growth is leveling off, and in the next few decades may even kind of reach, maybe in 100 years or so, may reach a leveling point where we kind of have humans self-selecting to not have as many offspring, and so we don't continually have this exponential growth. But the short answer to this question is that yes, Malthus was right. There is a crisis point. However, we have not yet reached that crisis point. And the last name that you need to learn in this discussion is Norman Borlaug. I took this from a screenshot of a website. Norman Borlaug is perhaps one of the most important and influential scientists with the lowest profile. Most people don't know his name. So if I say Mendel or if I say Darwin, there's a good chance, especially if you have any sort of even high school education, but certainly if you've gone to college, you know those names. But if I say Norman Borlaug, you're like, what? Who? I don't know who that is, right? Norman Borlaug is sometimes called the father. He's one of the most important figures in what is called the Green Revolution. And there are other workers and other people who contributed, but he received the Nobel Prize for this and really is the answer to why we have not yet reached the crisis point that Thomas Malthus predicted. So Norman Borlaug was responsible, and largely, but amongst other people, amongst other workers, helped to innovate and develop what we call the Green Revolution. Now, the Green Revolution is our modern approach to agriculture. It means using crop rotation techniques, using pesticides, using fertilizers, right? So these, sorry, I have something caught in my throat. Using these fertilizers that are based in largely hydrocarbons, right? Oil, we can turn it into fertilizers. We can take nitrogen from other sources, using crop rotations, using pesticides, using all of these modern equipment, modern techniques. And we have been able to dramatically increase the productivity of our land. Whereas you might get X number of bushels from an acre of land if you're growing wheat or corn or rice or something. If you use these techniques, you could double, triple, maybe even 10 or 20 times as much from each acre of land. And so that has allowed our food supply to keep up to date with our exponential population growth. We make more than enough food to support all people on Earth. Now, there are distribution and political problems, so not everybody gets enough food in all places, although usually those are temporary. We have famines, we have wars that reduce that, but often those are addressed fairly rapidly. In fact, we have so much food that in much of the world, we have obesity problems, right? This is a major issue in America. We not only make enough food for ourselves, we make in excess, and so that has resulted in some of the obesity and health issues that come along with that. So, Thomas Malthus was right, but Norman Borlaug and those responsible in the Green Revolution have kept us above that. So this is kind of I just thought this was funny that agriculture is how we get around Mother Nature's murder attempts, right? This crisis point. So we have not reached it. Now, with that said, there are some downsides to this approach. Certainly, pesticides, and especially if they're not controlled well, have a problem. Modern fertilizers have issues also, and there are environmental consequences to that. And we're seeing the results of some of those consequences. So our modern approach may be sustainable with some slight modifications, may be sustainable for 8 million people. Oceans are another issue, and we really need to address that. That's maybe harvesting of oceans, and that's not really agriculture, but we've beginning to do aquaculture that might help us to mitigate some of the impacts that we're having on the oceans. So whether or not our current strategies are long-term sustainable is another question. But certainly the Earth at current levels can support nearly 8 billion people, which is what we have. Now the question is, can we support 10 billion people or 20 or 50 billion? And at some point, even with the very, very best of technology, there's going to be a finite limit to how many humans we can support on Earth, and particularly if we're looking at the long-term impact and consequences of that. Now, again, I mentioned this in the last lecture, but signs are good that we probably are not going to have to figure out how to support 50 billion people on Earth, because as populations grow and as we get better and better standards of living, people choose to self-regulate and we don't have as many offspring. So most likely projections, again, are about 10 or 11 billion people is about where Earth's population of humans will plateau. But even 10 billion might be tricky to sustain in a long term. So we don't know exactly where this crisis point is. If that crisis point might move as we have more and more of an impact on our ecosystem. Global warming plays a role in this. Our overfishing of the oceans, pollution plays a role in this. And so it's a dynamic, ongoing thing. So there is hope, and modern technology is great at finding solutions and getting around these. And you will see throughout the rest of your life the ongoing process of this and the struggle to find better and better ways to support and sustain and maintain standard of living for the human population.